Eradicating Pathology, Preserving Diversity, Genetic Deafness Research in 20th Century America. Marion Schmidt, PhD, University of Leuven Disability History Lecture Series. Today, advances in genetic technology provide parents with choices and decisions unavailable before. In the past decade, several deaf couples have made the headlines for wanting a deaf child and for using genetic knowledge to pursue this goal. Like many parents, they would like their children to be like them and wish to pass on their identity. These instances have become teaching cases in bioethics, as well as rallying points for the deaf and disability movements. The history of eugenics is frequently evoked in this debate, and no figure more often than Alexander Graham Bell. Most people know Bell as the inventor of the telephone. In deaf and disability history, however, he has a more ominous reputation. Bell also was a eugenicist who bred sheep on his farm in Nova Scotia. Throughout his life, he was interested in deafness and the mechanics of hearing and speech. This was a personal as much of a scientific interest. Both his mother and his wife were hard of hearing. Early in his career, in order to earn money for his invention plans, Bell followed his father into the family business of teaching speech to the deaf. Engaged in education and eugenics, Bell became interested in the inheritance of deafness. He studied marriage and school records of families in which deafness occurred. He presented the results of this research in an 1883 talk to the American Academy of Science, titled Memoir upon the Formation of a Deaf Variety of the Human Race. Deaf people, Bell concluded, had a harmful tendency to marry each other. In doing so, he believed, they passed on deafness to the next generation. In the long term, Bell feared, this might create a separate race of deaf people. Such a defective race of human beings, quote, would be a great calamity to the world, end quote. The problem, he claimed, was created by deaf education. Deaf children, at the time, were educated in state-funded boarding schools. These schools used sign language, or the manual method, something Bell was highly critical of. He believed that sign language isolated and separated the deaf from their hearing. Instead, he favored oralism, the teaching of speech and lip reading. Bell's solution to the threat of a deaf race thus was more pedagogic than eugenic. If the deaf were educated in oralist day schools, they would integrate into hearing society, choose hearing partners, and thus avert the dangers of creating a deaf race. Over a century later, in 2003, the American geneticist Walter Nance confirmed Bell's fears in a modernist way. The fact that American deaf people form their own culture and community, and that for the last 150 years they have lived and married predominantly within this community, apparently had indeed increased the frequency of a certain form of deafness. This form, Connection 26 deafness, is now responsible for half of all genetic cases in the US. Nance, however, reacted very differently to this development. Bell had feared the creation of a deaf race. Nance, on the other hand, feared the effects of modern genetic technology on the deaf community. He asked, quote, will future critics view this development as one of the medical triumphs of the 21st century, or as an egregious example of cultural genocide? Between Nance and Bell, we have here then two very different ideas about what scientific progress is and whom it should serve. How American heredity researchers came from the fear of a deaf mute race to the fear of harming biocultural diversity is the topic of my presentation. Tying together the history of science and medicine, disability and deafness, I ask why we perceive otherness as pathological and deviant, or as valuable diversity. Research of and attempts to prevent hereditary deafness reflect changing scientific and cultural norms of who is considered normal or disabled, a good citizen or a burden to society. My focus will be on the changes in genetic counseling for deafness in the last third of the 20th century, when genetic professionals reframed their goals and ethics, and when patient, disability, and deaf activists challenged medical and scientific authority. Before though, I want to give an overview of eugenic and deafness research in the earlier parts of the 20th century. It is hard to overstate Alexander Graham Bell's influence on research of and counseling for deafness. Bell was the most influential proponent of oralism in the United States. He criticized American schools for the deaf for relying predominantly on manualism or sign language. Sign language, however, also was one of the core traits, and indeed the pride of the deaf community, which had developed around schools for the deaf. It was a vibrant and flourishing community, with its own newspapers, associations, clubs, and churches. However, by the late 19th century, American deaf community and culture increasingly came to be viewed with suspicion. In this period, nativist movement gained influence in the US and demanded that immigrants, Native Americans, and other minority groups assimilated to mainstream Anglo-Saxon white American culture and language. Oralism also had strong ties to evolutionary and eugenic thought. During the early and mid-19th century, sign languages had been considered a God-given natural language. Evolutionary and Darwinist thought changed us. Now it was speech that distinguished and elevated man from gesticulating apes and savages. Bell, too, agreed with this assessment. He rejected coercive eugenic measures such as marriage restrictions and sterilization in favor of education and persuasion. He believed that teaching deaf people speech and lip reading would integrate them into hearing society, make superfluous residential schools, and thus remove all incentives for deaf intermarriage. Bell's beliefs dominated deaf education and counseling into the 1950s. In the first decades of the 20th century, deaf people's family life and reproduction came under intense scrutiny. In the US, however, deaf individuals and associations lobbied successfully against being included in sterilization legislation and other restrictive eugenic measures, which affected people labeled as feeble-minded or defective. Deaf community members insisted that they were intelligent and responsible citizens, and thus capable of voluntarily abiding to eugenic principles. Teachers for the deaf agreed with this assessment, but they felt responsible for counseling their students on their genetic makeup. Schools for the deaf often provided their students with some kind of hereditary advice based on family and student records. During the first half of the 20th century, the goals of genetic deafness research were clear. More knowledge would improve diagnosis and prognosis, and thus improve genetic counseling and prevention. Most generally, deaf people were told not to marry another deaf person for oralistic and for eugenic reasons. By mid-century, this alliance between oralism and eugenics came apart, ironically in a time when genetics for the first time made progress in identifying the genetic basis of deafness. The 1950s and 60s were a crucial period in changing perceptions of disability and minorities in American society, and in changing the relationship between doctors and patients, researchers, and their research populations. In post-war America, the definition and perception of disability changed. It was no longer only an innate deficit to be overcome by the individual, but a socially and culturally determined phenomena. Several factors were at play here. For one, during the post-war years, social scientists began to explore the lives and cultures of social and ethnic minorities, such as Black people, Hispanics, or immigrants, and increasingly deaf and disabled people too. Linguists began to study the structure and grammar of sign language, most famously Willem Stokoe, who declared sign language a proper and legitimate language. Second, mid-century America saw a great deal of interest in disability and rehabilitation, caused partly by World War II and the Korea War. The very goal and definition of rehabilitation changed in this period. After World War I, it had aimed primarily at restoring the disabled body to being able to work, to being a productive citizen. Disability, in this definition, was primarily a physical defect to be overcome. Now, in the 1950s, rehabilitation workers became interested in the psychological and sociological dimensions of disability. How did it change a person's psyche? How attitudes toward life, toward family? How, in turn, did society react to people with disabilities? How did their bias and preconceptions influence social interaction? Already in the 1950s then, and yes, disability was understood as a psychosocial phenomenon, part of a larger debates over health and minority rights. The 1950s and 60s too were the decades in which medical genetics developed into a thriving field. With the backdrop of the Holocaust and the Cold War, geneticists portrayed their field as a democratic, benevolent science, far removed from the coercive eugenics of the past. Often, this was only a superficial distancing, and this did not mean that eugenic prevention caused to be an important goal. Yet attention shifted from the total population to the individual. This opened venues for more client-centered definitions of defect and disability. The career of Walter Nance, who I mentioned earlier, unfolded among these changes in genetics and in perceiving disability, minorities, and healthcare rights. Born in 1933 in Manila, the Philippines, to an American military doctor, he had gotten an MD from Harvard Medical School in 1954. Yet he soon found that he was much more interested in tracing genetic traits than in treating illness. Thus, he went on to get a PhD in genetics. After finishing his degree, he added the division of medical genetics at Vanderbilt University and offered genetic counseling at the local hearing and speech center. Like many of his generation, Nance embraced the model of non-directive, client-centered counseling. That is, counseling was to serve the client's individual wishes, rather than social or eugenic goals. At the same time, like most geneticists at this time, Nance considered deafness a grave pathology, and genetics a promising means to prevent the suffering caused by disease and disability. Soon, however, he encountered patient perspectives that challenged this definition of what suffering and disability were in the first place. He recalled in 1977, quote, "It is a sobering experience to spend an hour communicating the facts of genetics to a deaf couple through an interpreter, only to be confronted by the question from the shy young bride, 'What is wrong with being deaf?'" End quote. What, indeed, was wrong with it? If one believed in genetics as a science serving the individual rather than society, in client autonomy and non-directiveness, there was no longer a normative answer to these questions. If some deaf people did not consider their deafness a disability, and even wished for a deaf child, then thought that a geneticist might well support them. Genetic knowledge, he believed, was as indispensable for deaf people and their families as it was for anyone else, maybe even more so. Yet it was unattainable to most deaf people. Genetic counseling for them and their family was, quote, "a major unmet need," end quote. Declaring that genetics does not receive the attention it deserves is a common theme in the history of genetics and medicine. So is the discovery of a new target population, who, supposedly, would benefit immensely from genetic services. Yet there was a twist in the way Nance presented his vision. Geneticists, he believed, did not show enough interest in and sensitivity to the values of the culturally deaf community. To reach them, geneticists needed to question their own position and find a form of counseling that was not threatening to a group whose family life and reproduction had long been under suspicion. By the late 1970s, 2 students and soon-to-be co-workers joined Nance's work toward this goal, Joan Bowman and Kathleen Arnos. Bowman received her PhD in genetics at the Indiana University Department of Genetics, headed by Walter Nance. There, she received a thorough education in the practices and ethics of counseling, and early on was involved in Nance's cases. Like him, encounters with deaf clients changed her perspectives on deafness and counseling alike. In counseling the deaf, client and counselor relied on an interpreter. Communication was not direct, the client's reactions and emotions mediated. To become a better, more efficient and compassionate counselor, Bowman decided she needed to learn sign language. Only by learning sign language, she believed, she would be able to react immediately and without distortion to clients' emotions, questions, and fears. For Bowman, learning sign language proved to be a transformative experience. It triggered an interest in learning more about deaf culture, initiated her to the deaf community, and opened new venues for counseling deaf clients. She described her experience, quote, "It was kind of like the ocean. First it's small waves, and then it just kind of consumes you." End quote. Counseling deaf people in sign language, a language not their own, made her aware of the terminology used in genetics, such as risk, defective, or normal. Risk, Bowman realized, was a relative concept, depending on client experience and background. As a population geneticist, she thought of risk as an abstract, statistic entity, calculated from pedigrees and population data. Yet their clients often understood risk in a manner quite different from her own statistician's perspective. Rather than the risk for a deaf child, they inquired, in American Sign Language, about their chance for such an outcome. Engaging with clients over their perception of risk and pathology, chance, turned counseling into an intercultural exchange in which a counselor explored and revised their emotions together with the clients. As a result, in her counseling, Bowman replaced the term risk by chance and encouraged her colleagues to do so too. Research of and counseling for genetic deafness, she became convinced, should be a cooperative enterprise, with input from geneticists and the deaf community. This required the geneticists not only to learn about deaf culture, as Walter Nance had done, but to become an accepted part of it. Bowman realized this vision with the last and youngest member of the team, Kathleen Arnos. Both Nance and Bowman had come to deafness via genetics. Arnos, on the other hand, came to genetics and deafness via psychology. While pursuing her BA in psychology, she had come into contact with the local deaf community and had started to learn sign language. Yet Arnos also was interested in the genetic aspect of deafness and pursued a PhD at the Indiana University under Nance and Bowman. Like Bowman, Arnos became enamored with deaf culture and sign language, a phenomenon that was telling for the changing perceptions of deafness in the 70s and 80s. In this period, American deaf people and organizations succeeded in bringing the language and culture to national theaters, televisions, and the news. Like other minority movements, they criticized discrimination and argued for equal rights and diversity. The right to health and access to healthcare also was an important motive to diverse social and minority movements, including the women's movement, civil rights movement, Latino, disability, or gay movements. Scientists and medical professionals, too, were drawn to the themes of equality and cultural diversity in healthcare. Here they could portray and perceive themselves as activists supporting the cause of minorities. Although Nance, Bowman, and Arnos were not directly involved with any of these movements, they clearly were inspired by them. Together, they realized a number of projects that would push further their vision of bringing culturally sensitive genetic services to deaf people. In the early 1980s, for example, Arnos and Bowman developed ASL Science for Genetic Counseling in collaboration with the DC area deaf community and American Sign Language linguists. Developing these science for genetic concepts such as amniocentesis, dominant or recessive, meant adapting genetics to deaf culture, universally also incorporating genetic concept into deaf culture. In 1982, Arnos began doing research at Gallaudet University, the world's first university for the deaf, and a flourishing center of American deaf culture. In 1984, they established a genetic service center there. It was to provide culturally sensitive counseling to an, quote, underserved minority, end quote. The program was federally funded as part of a larger campaign to increase access to genetics for minorities who faced, quote, linguistic and cultural barriers to genetic counseling, end quote. Education, screening, counseling, and research were part of the center's scope. Arnos served as director, Bowman and Nance as consulting experts. By the 1980s then, American funding agencies accepted the notion that deaf people were a socio-cultural minority. This minority model, however, also had limitations when it came to legitimizing genetic services. Unlike other socio-cultural minorities, deaf people's status as a minority depended on a physical and potentially genetic trait. Moreover, syndromic forms of deafness challenged the notion of deafness as a merely non-pathological trait. As Arnos argued, early, if not prenatal diagnosis, was crucial to identify cardiological, endocrinological, or metabological problems that were inherited together with deafness. This constellation supposedly made the deaf a, quote, genetic high-risk group, end quote, and supposedly gave geneticists reversely a special responsibility to provide culturally and linguistically appropriate services. Counseling at the center combined these elements with non-directive counseling in sign language. An important first step was to inquire why a client was seeking genetic evaluation. Motivations ranged from medical or reproductive concerns to plain curiosity. Some clients wanted to learn their chances for hearing or deaf children. Some explicitly wished for deaf children or hearing children. Some simply wanted to know why they were deaf. Clients also sought genetic counseling for conditions other than deafness or unrelated deafness, such as cancer or Tay-Sachs disease. When a client came to the center, the staff took a family history, audiograms, and clinical examinations. Then followed one or more counseling sessions. Ideally, by this time, the counselor was able to provide a definite diagnosis. Yet in about 1 in 4 cases, the type of deafness could not be identified. By the mid-1980s, more than 100 forms of genetic deafness had been identified. By the early 1990s, the number had grown to circa 200. At the same time, however, many other forms remained or underdefined. The inability to provide definite diagnosis could have been seen as a failure. After all, most clients came to the center to learn why they were deaf. Yet diagnostic insecurity only reinforced the nature of counseling as an intense encounter between counselor, client, and their family. Counseling, Arnos believed, was as much psychotherapy as fact-giving. Retreating from decisive, directive, or definite positions, genetic counseling instead gained authority as a helping, supportive, and non-judgmental profession. Borrowing from the rhetoric of healthcare activism, the center also claimed an explicitly political dimension. Becoming a genetically informed citizen was an empowering act, a way of regaining control over one's body. For most of the century, geneticists had viewed deaf people's lives and deaf people's family life and reproduction with suspicion, if not as a threat. Reversely, among deaf people, genetics has acquired a reputation as a discipline intent to restrict their civil freedoms, if not to eradicate deafness and deaf culture altogether. Yet in the US, a different, more cooperative paradigm emerged in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. The rise of culturally sensitive counseling for deafness was part of larger trends in the last third of the 20th century. Changes in perceiving difference and disability in US society, minority and health activism, and the psychologization and individualization of genetic counseling. Receptive to these changes, some professionals began to engage with the target population in order to make genetic services more accessible. These encounters between geneticists and deaf people challenge assumptions about pathology, defect, and the goals of counseling. Culturally sensitive genetic counseling has become quite influential in the US. Most genetics and counseling literature on deafness today at least acknowledges, if not embraces, the existence of a deaf culture and community. Other disciplines, including audiology and speech pathology, still pursue a curative pathological model, embrace cochlear implants, for example, as a means to overcome the otherness of deafness. While the focus here is on cure and prevention, American geneticists have found a new way to establish professional authority and identity. In the language of minority and health movements, they cast themselves as activists fighting for the rights of minorities. This, in turn, turns genetics once again into a political science, a development I find problematic.